What do you anticipate the level of unemployment will be in the fourth quarter of this year?
I don't have a precise estimate. There are a range that are out there from the Bank of England and the OBR. Most of them point to around a double-digit percentage unemployment rate. Obviously, the numbers you would have seen today show just under a million new claims in the last month, over 800,000, taking total number of claims to 2 million. I think the OBR estimate had that tapping out at about 3 million. Obviously, the impact will be severe. We're seeing that already, as I said, in the universal credit claims data. And obviously, there are 8 million people who are currently furloughed. And that demonstrates the degree of stress in the labour market and in corporate health. And obviously, over time, we hope as many of those people can return to the jobs that they have. And that's very much our ambition and why we put the scheme in place.
But quite a lot of those people who are currently being furloughed are in fact already unemployed, are they not?
No, they are furloughed, and that was exactly the point of the scheme, was to prevent mass unemployment happening immediately as a result of the lockdown and the restrictions on businesses operating, which is why I took the decision to introduce the furlough scheme, because I wanted to protect people's jobs and livelihoods, no fault of their own, that their business had been closed down to avert a public health crisis. And that's why we implemented the scheme. It allows employees to remain attached to their employers. That attachment, we know, is critical, and hopefully allows the companies to hibernate for the short term. And as restrictions are progressively released and our economy returns to normal, allows as many of those jobs to be protected as possible. But you're absolutely right in the sense that I've said very clearly, although we've put unprecedented mitigating actions in place, I certainly won't be able to protect every job and every business. We're already seeing that in the data, and no doubt there will be more hardship to come. This lockdown is having a very significant impact on our economy. We are likely to face a severe recession, the likes of which we haven't seen, and of course that will have an impact on employment.
Okay, I was making the point that they were probably unemployed because the OBR and others have changed their view that we will be having a V-shaped recovery to a more of a U-shaped recovery. But do you accept that the length and depth of that recession you referred to will be very much related to the length of the lockdown?
Yeah, that's self-evident, and indeed is what the OBR specifically has said, and indeed the Bank of England. I think there's also two things to distinguish. One is the immediacy of the economic impact, the depth of the recession, which we are currently passing through, and there's a range of estimates between 25 and 35% between the Bank of England and the OBR on that. But I think actually the question that occupies my mind, and indeed in long term is probably more relevant, is what degree of long-term scarring is there on the economy as a result of this recession? What is the debt? What is the loss in productive capacity? Because ultimately, once we recover from this crisis, by nature, I believe it will be temporary. Of course, we've suppressed the virus. We will progressively now lift the restrictions. The question is, what do we return to? And the question there, the jury is out. As you said, the OBR in their reference scenario forecast essentially 0% scarring. The Bank of England have indicated they believe it might be around 1%. The IMF have said it might be 3 or 4%. I think we're clearly dealing with something that is unprecedented, so economic forecasting is less precise than it would be. But you are right to say the longer the depth of the recession, I think everyone would agree, all economic forecasters and economists would agree, the longer the recession, it is likely the degree of that scarring will be greater.
So have you done any analysis as to at what point the lockdown measures cause more harm than good?
Well, I think, in what sense you're describing harm, I think where I completely, what I'd say is echo what the Prime Minister has said, and I think what we said in our publicly in our document, is that the current arrangements, the lockdown is not, and the lockdown doesn't provide an enduring solution. The price paid is too heavy for our way of life, for our society, for our economy, and indeed for our long-term public health. I think that's evident. It is necessary in the short term to put in place the measures we did in order to suppress the virus and allow the NHS time to build up capacity to make sure that it was not overwhelmed. And so far that has been the case. Right? The NHS has not been overwhelmed. There's considerable spare capacity in our intensive care units in particular, and the NHS has done an extraordinarily good job of coping. But we've set out a plan to progressively lift those restrictions to try and return life back to as much as normal as we can. And you're right, there are impacts of the lockdown. Those, indeed, as the Chief Medical Officer says, there are the health impacts, not least because people we know are not going to treatment that they otherwise will have sought. We see that in cancer referrals, cancer treatments and screening, which Chief Medical Officer has talked about. That's happening right now. People in A&E showing up or not where otherwise they might have. But obviously longer term, the economic impacts of the lockdown have an impact on our health as well, our ability to finance the NHS, the impact that unemployment will have on people's chronic health conditions. There's very good work from the IFS, which have talked about, I think, around a 2% rise in or fall in employment leading to about a million more chronic health conditions, for example. So we know that there are impacts. The impact on children's learning would be another one. I think it's probably difficult to simplify it down to a single date, but of course we're trying to balance all those things and have said this is not an enduring solution, and which is why we have a roadmap to progressively ease the restrictions and put in place better surveillance and test, track and trace to help us manage the virus long term.
Yeah, I can see how difficult this is, but how comfortable are you with the range of models and the fact that there's such uncertainty about the data in which to put into models? I mean, you'll be very familiar with the expression of garbage in, garbage out with models. I mean, I was very struck, if we go back to 1996, when we had to deal with the BSE crisis, that at the time, some of the projections for the number of people who would die of CGD were up to 100,000 and more. And in the end, it was less than 200. And it was because of the uncertainty and the lack of the models. You're having to take decisions to spend hundreds of billions of pounds on very uncertain modelling with very limited data. Are you comfortable with that?
Yes. Well, obviously, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I probably have more familiarity with economic or certainly financial models, and I completely agree. Garbage in, garbage out. And I would, as I said, I think economic models right now have less value than they would normally. I think the OBR and the Bank of England both talked about the unprecedented uncertainty that we are facing, which makes the job of economic forecasting in particular more difficult. So we should obviously have humility about the value of the models and the precision with the results that they generate. Look, I'm not as I said, I'm not an epidemiologist. I presented with the conclusions of our scientific advisors. They themselves draw on a range of different models within them. There are different modelling groups, as I understand it, amongst them, and they come to a scientific consensus that we use to make our decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I was really making the point about back in 1996, because the models suggested we should slaughter the entire national herd, and there were very extreme suggestions put forward, but ministers had to take a view on and operate with a wider view of what was in the interest of the economy and agriculture overall. Baroness Bowles.
I'm conscious that the government's support schemes are still a work in progress and being added to, but can you give us your latest estimate of how much they will cost, and when do the schemes become too expensive?
Thank you, Lady Bowles. I think probably the best estimate there is the OBR reference scenario, which has been updated, which points to a direct fiscal cost of over £100 billion. I just make sure I answer your question completely. I'd say that there are buckets of cost. So there's direct cost of spending on various schemes. So, for example, our business rates grants, £10,000 and £25,000 going to up to 1 million eligible businesses. That costs about £12 billion. Providing business rates holidays or cancellation of business rates for the entire retail, hospitality and leisure sector. that costs around another £12 billion. We have a statutory sick pay rebate scheme that is going live shortly. That could cost between £1 and £2 billion. And then obviously we have the job retention programme and the self-employed scheme, which between the two of them are likely to cost in the tens of billions of pounds, several tens of billions of pounds by the time those schemes are wound down, with the furlough scheme recently being extended through to the autumn. Then on top of that, there will be, those are the costs this year. We've also invested in public services, which one might argue is a direct cost, but it's not a support scheme, and already that total is around £14 billion. There are also welfare changes we've made, which would be several £billion to strengthen the safety net this year. And then there are the costs that we will only know down the line, which are still direct. And by those, I would mean the tax deferrals and loan guarantees. So we've provided considerable flexibility for people to make tax deferrals, both on VAT, income tax self-assessment, those total north of £30 billion, and also tens of billions of pounds in loan guarantees. Now, obviously, depending on what happens to those guarantees and those loans and what happens to those deferrals, there will be a fiscal cost from those as well, but we will not know that for some point in the future, more likely.
So you're not envisaging changing them, particularly from the direction they have? You'll have to stop them at some point. I mean, there must be a point. You can't go on forever.
Well, most of all the things I mentioned, actually, most of them have a finite time already. The business rates holidays are for this year. For example, the cash grants were one-off. The loan programs run on through to the autumn, when those loan programs are no longer available. That will be the same with the future fund that is launching tomorrow. So in one sense, the only moving part was the furlough scheme, which we've now set a time limit on. It was extended it for 4 more months, so it will run to October. And at that point, all of the schemes will have wound off, or there will be things that will have lasted for the full year, but they're knowable costs today, for example, business rates.
So what do you think that this means for the budget deficit this year? Because there were some leaked reports that it might be as high as 337 in a most likely scenario, and that was a sort of leaked Treasury document compared to the 55 million that was hoped for in the budget. But obviously times have changed since then. I mean, it will be what it will be. I don't think that there's anything wrong in having these support measures, but what's the best estimate there? Because that is substantially more than the OBR.
Yeah, I think, look, the OBR recently updated their numbers, and I would point you to that. I think that the unknowable, it will be significant, and it will be significant by historic standards, clearly. I think that the unknowable is actually on the tax side. It's when we actually start to see the next month or two of public finance, the tax collection coming in, will we have a clearer sense. But because what we've talked about is the spending side of things, where we know what we're doing, give or take. But what we don't know fully yet is how significant the hit on the tax revenue side will be, and that picture will only become clearer in the weeks and months ahead. But I would also say this is unprecedented action fiscally. Clearly, given the scale of what we're talking about and the numbers we've just talked through together, I think I genuinely believe that the situation, medium and long term, and indeed short term, would have been considerably worse had we not taken this action. And indeed, that was the conclusion from both the Bank of England and indeed the Office for Budget Responsibility.
So your attitude really is you're continuing to do what it takes, and we'll have to deal with the cost in due course.
Yes, I mean, of course, that's right. And so what's guided me, it goes back to that conversation we had at the beginning with Lord Forsyth around, there's obviously an immediate hit to the economy, but what we're actually trying to do is, as well as, there's not a lot of that we can mitigate, because ultimately it's a function of us closing down the economy, right? So, if we close down the economy, there's a pretty significant impact that we can't really do very much about, because the whole point is we try to stop that economic activity from happening. That was the point of the exercise, to help control public health. But what I've been trying to do with the interventions is, as we talked about, preserve as much of our productive capacity as we can, keep as many companies in a viable state, keep as many people attached to those companies, so that when the restrictions are released, when the economy can function as normal, we haven't lost a considerable number of those jobs and those businesses, because that's what causes the permanent damage or the medium-term damage, and that's what has a significant impact on our public finances. It's one thing that we'll have obviously increased debt as a result of the interventions this year, but medium-term, what will matter is what's the size of our economy, what kind of structural deficit or not are we looking at as a result of any scarring that might have happened. And the actions I've taken over the last weeks and months, I hope will limit that scarring and limit the impact on our medium-term public finances.
And so it's your best shot, as it were, to try and get a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery rather than it be a miserable L-shaped. Well,
it's the alphabet soup of things. I think one thing is I guess the speed of the recovery is one thing, the sharpness of the recovery. I think the scarring part is, well, how far do you recover, right? And you remember in the OBR reference scenario, there was essentially a full recovery to where output reached where it was before the crisis. Now, I think, as Law Forsyth mentioned, the OBR suggested that may no longer be their base case. It certainly was not the Bank of England, or indeed is not the IMF. So, and that it's that gap, actually. It's the once we recover, hopefully relatively swiftly, is what's the degree of that scarring? What's the medium and long-term impact on our economy as a result of what's happened over the past few months?
I was just saying, so you do hope for a relatively quick uptick, as it were.
Well, I think we all would hope. We would hope that it is as swift and strong as it can be. I mean, clearly, as we're seeing now, we're getting data from around Europe as people, and around the world as countries are progressively easing and lifting restrictions. It is not obvious that there will be an immediate bounce back. It takes time for people to get back to the habits that they had. There are still restrictions in place, even if we can reopen retail, which we very much like to be able to do. And on the 1st of June, there still will be restrictions on how people can shop, which will have an impact likely on how much they spend and how many people go out. And those things will all take time. So I think in all cases, it will take a little bit of time for things to get back to normal, even once we've reopened currently closed sectors.
Baroness Kingsmill, you wanted to come in on this question.
Just briefly, Chancellor, you've got a tough task ahead, and you're dealing with it as well as can be expected. But I'm wondering how much you're balancing the pressures that are on you at the moment with those that are likely to come in the event of when Brexit happens.
Yeah, I mean, I would say somewhat separate things. So I think right now, obviously, we've taken a set of specific measures to contain a health crisis, and that has implications for our economy, which we've, as I said, tried to mitigate both in the short and medium term. With regard to our negotiations with the European Union, they continue, and David Frost is, I forget which round he's currently in, but those talks are ongoing. We've been very clear with our partners that we don't have any intention of extending. We believe we've put forward a highly reasonable set of proposals based almost entirely on precedent, on things that the EU has already agreed with other partners. And in that vein, we hope that we can have a constructive discussion on it. But the negotiations are ongoing.
Yeah, let's not get.
I wasn't really asking about Brexit itself. I was just wondering how you balance up what you have to do now for this crisis with the potential for another crisis in future. I wasn't really interested in the Brexit issue right now in this conversation, but just where there's a balancing act to be played. I'm
not sure what the future crisis that you might be referring to is, but I certainly wouldn't see our trading relationship and the degree to which we negotiate a tariff schedule as being in that is anywhere near in magnitude to what we're currently dealing with.
Okay, Lord Burns.
Chairman, I'd like to decline interest as I am a trustee of 2 arts organisations which have used the job retention scheme. And in terms of the job retention scheme, Chancellor, you have said that it will be extended until October. Do I interpret from the other remarks that you made in response to an earlier question that you don't have plans to extend the support to the self-employed at the same time?
I think what I've said clearly on that is that they are 2 different schemes and they have 2 different purposes. Obviously, which I know you and other members of the committee will appreciate, a job retention scheme is designed to keep people attached to their employer, and that's what it's designed to do based on the economic theory behind that. And obviously, given that there are redundancy periods in place of 45 days, that influences some of the timing around providing people with certainty and clarity over the future, and especially as sectors that are closed and now have a timetable for hopefully reopening can plan in advance. It was important to provide, I think, that degree of timetable to all of those sectors. The self-employment scheme is by nature different. We have, as has been well documented, we don't have information to know what the individual circumstances are of those who are self-employed. They don't have the same attachment to an employer. Ultimately, they are their own employer. They can, as we speak, could still be working and also in receipt of a self-employment grant. So it is a very different scheme in that regard, and I think about it differently, and continue to review it as I do all other schemes.
Chancellor, when you announced the support for self-employed in March, you said that if we all want to benefit equally from state support, we must all pay equally in future. This was interpreted by a number of people implying that possibly there was some equalisation in various taxes or contributions that are made between self-employed and the employed. Now, I don't wish to press you on, actions in forthcoming budgets, as I know how sensitive that is. But in general terms, what was that interpretation people put on that phrase accurate?
I think as you would appreciate well, it wouldn't be right for me to comment on future budgets or future tax policy on anything, and that's the reasonably standard answer I give to all these types of questions. So there can be no over-interpretation of what I say. But I would just refer people to the comments I made. I think that they're clearly the comments I made at the time are the comments that I would make again.
Okay. Could I, a more general point, Chancellor? Those of us, like yourself, who have followed for a long time the problems of monetary and fiscal policy over the decades, know the hazards of taking actions when there are long lags between those actions, in a sense, and the outcome. And we've often seen the charge, the policy was too little too late, and then at a later stage it was too much too late. Are you concerned that we're steering at the moment by decisions on relaxing the lockdown by monitoring the deaths figures, which are quite clearly a lagging indicator? I mean, are we not in danger of not relaxing the lockdown soon enough by following a lagging indicator?
Well, I think you make a factual observation of all the various indicators one can track. Obviously, mortality is the one that happens last. I would say also, we do measure, or the scientists measure the R rate, which is a measure of transmission in the community at the moment, which, as I say, is a more real-time indicator, although, of course, is also, as we've discussed previously, is subject to judgment and models like everything else and assumptions, although that is now buttressed by survey data that we're collecting at an increasingly large scale, which improves the accuracy of those estimates, but also by the overall infection rate in the community, which obviously impacts the effectiveness of a test, track and trace operation, just having a pool of people that you can handle. So I think all of those things are relevant in the conversation, and I believe are relevant in the scientists' minds as they provide this advice.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay, just on that point on the self-employed, you may not have had a chance to read the subcommittee's report on IR 35, where one of the points was made was that the policy of trying to equalize the tax rules for self-employed and contractors leads to more zero rights employees, that is, those who pay the same tax, but with fewer rights and less security than those on PAYE. Now, the Taylor report recommended creating a new status, a new employment status, which the government said they accepted, but nothing's happened on it. Is that one of the things on your agenda?
Well, I think obviously that would be primarily a question for the Secretary of State for Bays, who's responsible for employment law. But I remember well the Taylor report, and I think, look, clearly I think currently there exists an inconsistency between, if I'm getting this right from memory, between how rules apply for tax purposes and how they do for employment purposes. And I think the report said that that inconsistency is something that deserves being looked at, which seems eminently reasonable. I think with regard to changes in status, I think the big change that happened was to the state pension and the eligibility for the self-employed to have access to the state pension, which in financial terms was a very significant improvement in state support, which represented obviously is thousands of pounds annually. So I think that was the most significant change that has happened previously. I think your broader point is right. People choose to work in different ways. Those different ways come with different benefits and costs, which obviously individuals can choose whether they prefer one mode of working over another.
Okay, Lord Fox.
I declare interest as set out in the register, including being director of a company that's invoked the job retention scheme. Chancellor, we've talked about the economy in a rather homogenous way, and we've talked about recoveries being J or B or whatever. But of course, there'll be a variety of different recoveries and a variety of different types of recovery by sector, but also by region and by country within the United Kingdom. So has the Treasury looked at the potential disparity which already exists, but is also now being driven by the devolved governments taking different policies in terms of unlocking their economies? Schools, for example, are an important element of unlocking the economy, not just teaching the children, but also letting the parents back into the economy. That's going to happen at different rates in different countries. So what is the Treasury's thinking on the effect of the different decisions being made in the devolved authorities on the rate of recovery in the nations of the United Kingdom?
Well, obviously, it will be for devolved authorities to make their own decisions in their area over things that they have competence on, and I'm sure they'll be making their own estimates of all of those things. I wouldn't disagree that children being back at school is not just good primarily and most importantly for the children themselves in terms of their educational and social development, but obviously has a beneficial impact on freeing up working parents to return to work. And we know from the survey data that that has been an issue for many parents. So yes, I agree that may well have an impact.
There's also potentially a fiscal impact in Scotland, for example. The Scottish government could take a different view on how it unwinds the furlough scheme, and that would have a financial effect, which at the moment is coming out of HMT, of Her Majesty's Treasury. So what's the Treasury's view if Scotland takes a divergent view on furlough?
Just to be clear, that the furlough scheme is a UK scheme, and as I said, it will apply nationwide to all sectors, all devolved authorities, all regions equally. And I've set out a very generous timetable all the way through to the end of October, which provides considerable runway for companies to start back up and for people to get back to work whilst maintaining, as we talked about before, making sure the scheme is overall affordable as well. So it is not differentiated, and I've made the decision for the United Kingdom as it is a United Kingdom policy. Okay,
well, I'm leaving that to one side. Going back to the discrepancy of recovery in different places, what plans is the government making to support those areas where recovery is going to be harder versus those areas where perhaps it might be more straightforward?
Well, I think, as we talked about before, the areas where it will be most challenged is in the sectors which have been closed and their ability to open up again. I mean, the most important thing to talk about recovery is actually to reopen the sectors that are closed. So I think first and foremost, we should be focused on that, which is why I think it was important that we set out a timetable to do that. June 1st for non-essential retail and July 4th for leisure and hospitality. Across those two industries, there are 3-4 million people that are employed, depending on the exact estimate. They're disproportionately younger, they're disproportionately lower paid, and it's critical that both for economic and social justice reasons that we try and find a way to get all of those people back to their places of work, and that will have to be done in a different way, obviously, and that work is ongoing with various industry task forces to find secure ways to reopen those types of businesses. We're seeing across Europe that is already happening, and indeed across the world. So there's much international precedent we can learn from. But the single best way to help all of those places actually to get them open in the first place.
So just finally, the particular sectors like the hospitality sector are concentrated in areas like coastal towns, for example. What support are you going to give to the local authorities there, who are kind of best placed to help rekindle the economies in those communities?
I'm not sure that fiscally they would be in the best place to help if there was something that one thought the entire sector needed help with. I wouldn't necessarily say they're concentrated just in coastal communities. I represent inland, very rural seat with 2 national parks, which is particularly impacted by all of this. And what we have done is already direct considerable support, particularly on that sector. So cash grants of up to £25,000 specifically for businesses in this sector, in recognition of the difficulty that they faced. So that has been quite considerable, and relative to their fixed costs, we did that grant scheme based on their business rates and their rateable value. That's sort of proxy for what rental payments might have been, or as a significant fixed cost for them. That was distributed through local authorities, but ultimately that was a scheme that we put in place at a national level.
Thank you.
Okay. On Lord Fox's point on regional differences, we're reading in the newspapers that the R factor, which the government has placed so much emphasis on, is very much lower in London, and that the number of new cases in London is lower. As London is the dynamo, London and the southeast for the economy as a whole, are you not tempted to, at least for London and the southeast, if these figures are correct, to move more swiftly with unlocking the lockdown?
I mean, I think, again, on something like that, we are guided a little bit as well by the advice from the scientists who have the best understanding of how the virus spreads and what difference that would make. That's currently not, as I understand it, their advice. I think what we have said is, in a reactive fashion, once things are reopened, which in an ideal world, it would be nice to reopen things everywhere. I think that's what we'd all prefer, to try and get life as back to normal for as many people as possible, for any parts of our country as possible. But what we say going forward is, in a reactive sense, because we'll have a much better surveillance operation, which is able to look at every part of the country and understand at a much more granular level what's happening. If there are isolated or regional or geographic flare-ups or things that need intervention, we could then intervene on a more specific basis. That's something that has been developed, and I think will be part of the future mix, and something the Prime Minister and indeed the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor have talked about as well.
And on Lord Fox's point about people, for example, restaurants and people who are involved in tourism and so on, you've said that you will extend the furlough scheme from August, but you've not said what percentage should be met by the employer. Why are you delaying telling employers that so they can plan? And how are people like restaurants, if we're still subject to social distancing, going to have the revenue to be able to do so? Were you not tempted to take a more sectoral approach to the furloughing?
No, I mean, we're talking about something that doesn't happen till August, and I said I would publish the details by the end of this month. So I think that will be plenty of time to plan. The reason I made the announcement about the extension earlier is because of the 45-day redundancy notice as well, which I wanted to make sure that we provided time ahead of that. So I think that does actually provide ample time for people to prepare, because they will have between the end of this month and August to think about that. I think it's I thought about a separate approach, and in practice it would be very difficult to implement. I think it's one thing if your business was closed down, that might be something you could look at, but trying to understand an entire supply chain for that industry and whether all those businesses should be eligible or not, it would be, I think, in practice very difficult to evidence, to enforce. So what we did was actually have a much more generous approach for everybody that lasted longer. Now, I do think it's right for people to make a contribution. Not only does that mean that we can afford to run the scheme for longer, which benefits more people for everybody, which I think is a good thing. I think it makes sure that the incentives are right, because what we want to do is incentivize businesses to also to reopen and to make the most of being reopened and be as productive as possible. And that's something that's been recognized by business groups and unions who understand and accept, in my conversations with them, the principle of an employer contribution. I take the point, it should not be set at a level that ultimately undermines the purpose of the scheme by accelerating redundancies of otherwise viable businesses. But once the business is open and is able to ramp up and has a sense of its future, then I think that is a reasonable thing to ask.
So are you saying that if the business is closed and can't reopen, like for example a restaurant, that they might be able to not have to make a contribution?
No, I was saying the sector approach is very difficult in practice to implement. One way that people suggested it could be done is for sectors that were closed and then reopened could have a different scheme. My point would be there's an entire supply chain of those companies, right, which actually in practice is very hard to start differentiating between businesses.
Okay, Viscount Chandos.
I should like to declare interests as it's set down in the register as a director of 2 companies and 1 higher education institution that are both beneficiaries of the job retention scheme and have been or may be applicants for loan schemes. Chancellor, the Economic Secretary announced this morning an extension to the large business interruption loan scheme, raising the limit from 50 million to 200 million, which I think is very welcome. I wondered what other thoughts you might have about extending the loan scheme, perhaps particularly for smaller companies where you've identified gaps in the existing schemes.
I think now actually we have the coverage that we want across all of our loan schemes, so there isn't a need for any changes. I mean, just to recap on the various schemes, we obviously have bounce back loan scheme, we have the C-bills, the coronavirus business interruption loan schemes, then we have the larger version of that scheme where an extension was announced today, and then we have the CCFF facility, which the Bank of England operates for us. And I guess in across those 4 schemes, we're covering north of 90% of, or around 90% or more of UK turnover and profit. And the companies that we would not be covering at that point are probably because they are, it's not because of a size constraint or anything else, it'd be probably because of their leverage and credit position where it wouldn't be appropriate for them to receive blanket loan guarantees from the government in that way. And so I think there was the last bit that we took some time to get right, partly because it's complicated, partly because it was less pressing, was companies that needed more than £50 million. And we were trying to figure out what the right solution there was in conversation with business groups and indeed the finance sector. There was opportunities or ideas that we could create a CLO structure, we could use the CCFF, and in the end, after going through all the options, settled on an extension to the the larger CBILS program as the best way to achieve that, and I think that has been warmly welcomed. But now, across all schemes, we have, I think we have the coverage that we want and need.
Thank you, Chancellor. I have to say, from what I see and hear, there does seem to me to be quite a significant gap between potential applicants for bounce-back loans and companies that may be eligible for the future fund, because clearly the future fund is very much angled at the sort of tech high end of the startup sector, and I certainly feel that there are a lot of companies that won't fit within that, and for whom, for one reason or another, the bounce back loan scheme is either inappropriate or insufficient.
Well, I'm not. I mean, I think actually the bounce back loan scheme has been enormously successful and popular. Close to 500,000 loans have gone out in just 2 weeks, and it's very simple, easy to use, and the feedback has been incredibly positive. So I think that does work for most people, in the sense that it's hard. The eligibility criteria are pretty straightforward. It's hard not to be eligible if you're any kind of basic operating business in that sense. So I think that actually, I would say that is working and very well, providing the coverage we want. The future fund is designed to do something else, and the structure is deliberate. I mean, these are companies which are highly risky because they're early stage companies. Many of them will not be profitable. They may not even have revenues yet. So putting taxpayer money at risk in those companies obviously is very different. And the way you can make it work, or the way that we've designed the scheme to work, is by having a standardized product, a convertible loan note instrument that provides protection to the taxpayer, but crucially it's match funded. So we're essentially using the private sector and private investors to do the credit or investment decision for us, investing alongside to help fill a financing gap that may exist at the moment because of the conditions. And that is a perfectly appropriate approach for companies that, as I said, don't, otherwise wouldn't qualify for loans and therefore loan guarantees, and they should not, because the taxpayer, shouldn't be lending money to companies like that.
Okay, Lord Fox, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, please. Thank you, Chairman. You mentioned CBILS and bounce back and the success in your terms of bounce back. One of the reasons for that seems to be that a large number of unsuccessful CBILS applicants were quickly pushed through the bounce back system by the banks, and the uncharitable would say that the banks were very keen to do that when none of their money was at stake. So Chancellor, are you 100% happy with the way the banks have performed around CBILS?
Yeah, I think the CBILS program, I think they're actually very different. The average loan size, for top of my head, I mean, these figures are approximate because I don't have them to hand, but when I last checked, the average loan size was about 150,000, maybe more, for CBILS, and more like 30,000 for bounce back. Those numbers are about a week out of date. I haven't got this week's in front of me, but order of magnitude, that's what they are. So they're two very different products. So I don't think you can say that, oh, it's just simply because they've shunted one to the other, right? Because the CBILS started at a much lower, at 25 at £25,000 before, so it wasn't actually designed for a lot of the small lending. And there are some consumer protection issues that we had to work through to make it possible. But I think that the CBILS program now, over 40,000 loans have been granted, and there are tens of thousands more that are being worked through. The approval rates are in the mid to high 80s last time I checked. So that does seem to be something that's working. We haven't done this before in the UK, so was it a bit slower to get going than I would have liked? Yes. As I said, we're all learned as we've gone through this. We haven't done this, unlike some countries across Europe who have done this before, so they have systems set up to do it. We didn't, so we had to design as we went. And we learned that there were some elements of the guarantee schemes that we had off the shelf that we needed to adapt for the current situation. But we made those changes as soon as the feedback came. We made those changes. That helped. And I think now across 2 schemes, to have over 500,000 loans in this space of time that we have, it ranks very favourably compared to, I think, almost anyone else who's doing this.
So you're happy with the banks?
I think they deserve praise for operationalising things at speed, which were not straightforward, and I'm grateful to their staff for doing that. And I think it's obviously easy for people in my position to make negative comments about banks, but actually it was the teams of people they had in their call centres over the first couple of weekends of these things to make sure that they could take people's calls and help get money to them. That wasn't always straightforward with a brand new loan scheme. People worked very hard to try and make that possible, and I'm grateful that they did. And like many other aspects of government, indeed, whether it's DWP or elsewhere, we're all dealing with people being away, being off sick. So there is a challenge in operationally delivering these things, which I'm grateful that they did. And as I said, I think they responded positively to the changes that we made in the scheme on C-bills. I continue to look at it. As I said, I would like to see the backlog cleared of people who have outstanding loan applications. The reason the backlog is there is because applications keep coming in and the loans are going out. So in a sense, that's a good thing. But I just want to make sure we keep up the pace and volume on that. And the bounce back loan scheme has seemingly been very straightforward, and people have been getting money in their account very quickly. And I'm very pleased. Again, that was a new loan scheme that was put together in record time, and Touchwood thus far has been easy for people to use, has got them the credit they need quickly. So I think that has been a good experience. Obviously, it's easier when you provide 100% guarantee in a standardised product. So you're right that focus should be on C-bills, and there, as I said, 40,000 out. That's very good. There's still more we can do. There's close 70-something thousand applications, so we need to work through the rest of those as quickly as possible.
They are still taking quite a long time, weeks and weeks in many cases.
Yeah, I completely in agreement with you that I would want to have that happen as quickly as possible. I think it's fair to just differentiate. You might suggest, well, are they holding things up unnecessarily because they're asking for things that they shouldn't be and going through over-onus things? We have now removed all of the reasons to ask for forward-looking guidance, cash flow forecast. There's no concern about that. There's a generous guarantee. So there's no practical reason that should be taking that time. If I was still getting the sense that was delayed, then I would be concerned. And indeed, as you said, the EST is in constant dialogue with them about that. If the delay is just genuinely an operational one, because there are people in call centres, they're taking calls, and there's a lot of demand, I am more sympathetic to that, because I think it's reasonable. We're all grappling with those. But the EST and I keep a close eye on this and share with you a desire for those remaining loans to be processed as quickly as possible.
Okay, Lord Monks.
Chancellor, do you agree that it's as we emerge from the hibernation that's been enforced on us, that it will be highly desirable to have a more resilient and sustainable economy with more resilient and more sustainable firms? One of the problems that's been revealed during the crisis is the excessive debt that litters too many balance sheets of prominent British companies, not just prominent ones, but all the way through the spectrum. And without you giving away any budgetary secrets, I'm wondering very much whether or not you view this as excessive debt on British balance sheets, and whether or not tax policy changes might be considered at some stage to reduce the advantages of debt over equity.
Well, I think from again my figures maybe are slightly different to yours, Lord Monks, but I'd say the UK, corporate indebtedness, I think was considerably down on where it was after the financial crisis. Where if you look at gearing ratios, so net debt as a percentage of equity, it's probably 70 something down to 40 or in the 30s. So it's close to halved. And then the other thing I look at is the UK's gross corporate debt as a percentage of GDP. relative to OECD peers. And again, we come on current numbers, we are much lower than the median, towards the bottom of the table on that. And again, probably halved from the financial crisis time. So I'm not sure there is in general a corporate indebtedness problem when you look at the stats for the sector as a whole. You're always going to have individual companies that have taken on too much leverage. But I'd say, I think looking at it across the board, it doesn't feel to me that that's the case.
Do you think it's necessary to build a more resilient and sustainable economy in this country? One which can survive crisis rather better than some companies are struggling to do at the moment, despite the very extensive public support that is being offered by you and by the government?
Yeah, I think that is a fair observation. I mean, as it was 10 years ago in the financial crisis, as it is now, when events like this come along, we look at all ourselves, whether it's government, whether it's businesses, whether it's organisations, whether it's schools, all of us, whether it's Parliament, and we look at how we operate, and what were we not prepared for, what do we not have contingency plans for when something like this comes along, and we will all, in all our various ways, learn from this and make sure that we are better prepared for something like this in the future. But I think your broader point about resilience is a fair one. I mean, all companies need to think about unexpected shocks that may come their way and plan for those prudently, and having balance sheet capacity is certainly one of them.
And just finally, Chairman, a different point, that in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, will you agree with me that it's going to be more important to prioritise growth over the repayment of debt? If growth takes place, the debt tends to take care of itself in due course. I'm not relaxed about the amount of debt, but I want to press the case very much for concentrating on economic growth, which can absorb our problems that we've got on the red side of our balance sheet.
I think everyone would agree that more growth is preferable. I think historically, when we've deleveraged, and there's plenty of people on this committee who will know this better than me. I think if you look at historic periods of deleveraging, it's probably come more from the inflation component than the real component of growth. So in that sense, I'm not sure that necessarily would be the best thing, because that would have impacts elsewhere. But more generally, do I believe that more growth is a good thing? Absolutely.
Okay.
In real growth.
Lord Monks reminds me of Ronald Reagan's famous quote when asked about the deficit. He said it was big enough to take care of itself. Interesting, you have one mind on that. Lord Livingston.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to declare my interest on the register, including chairmanship of Dixon's Carphone and also trustee of the Social Care Charity. Both of these organisations have utilised some of the available supports. First of all, Chancellor, I'd very much like to commend you and the Treasury team for the breadth and speed of the measures that you've taken. These things are not easy at a time of crisis, and of course they may not have been perfect, but I think the amount of work and the thought that went into it is to be hugely commended. Now looking as hopefully as we move out of the crisis to recovery, and in businesses in particular, the first thing that tends to be dropped is investment. And there's plenty of reasons now for businesses not to invest, and not a lot of reasons to invest. And I wondered whether you and the Treasury have given thought to mechanisms that could encourage people to bring investment forward. For example, in the area of capital allowances, by maybe expanding their width and increasing the rate for larger companies, but only for a short-term period. So giving them a reason to bring forward expenditure that might otherwise wait till perhaps things were more certain.
Well, first of all, thank you, Lord Listening, for your very kind words, which I appreciate. It's very nice of you to say, and I broadly agree that I think look, there's been a long-standing issue with investment in this country. I mean, that the stats on that are clear, and I'm sure you as a committee have discussed them in the past. So there's a general reason that one might want to try and encourage more corporate investment, and there's obviously a more timely one now if it might help fuel a recovery. Again, it's tricky for me to get drawn because I don't want to get drawn into writing future budgets, so I can't answer specifically. But what I would say is in the last budget that we had, that I delivered in March, there were a couple of significant changes in this direction. One was the structures and buildings allowance, going from 2 to 3%, which is something that had been asked for, which will improve the incentive to invest. We obviously retain the annual investment allowance of £1 million until the end of this year. That had been extended. That benefits about 90-something% of businesses, but it doesn't obviously cover 90% of all investment, which is done by a small number of larger firms. But that, I think, for smaller companies, that obviously works well, because essentially it is what you are asking for. It's full expensing for all the small companies. And then we also increased the R&D tax credit rate, which provides several thousand firms with, I forget the exact number, but something north of £10,000 or £13,000, which is a different type of investment, but nonetheless important. So look, you've seen some directions of travel from me on that particular question already. As I said, we've got a long-standing issue. There might well be an argument for looking at things in the shorter term to help drive the recovery. But like everything else, I just can't get drawn on future budgets now.
Thank you, and I understand that. I probably would add that looking at credits as well as mere tax deductions for a lot of companies who actually won't have any taxable profits to offset is going to be a particular case. Is there anything else being considered either by the Treasury or across business in terms of supporting future investment? I mean, the UK has had some lack of equity capital in the past for growth, and didn't have some of the, for instance, that they had in Germany. It was grandfathered, I believe, under state aid rules, some of the support from government investment, that perhaps the government can take a more activist role in supporting the equity gap, or indeed any other forms of supporting investment that are sort of not directly in the form of the taxation system.
I mean, I think where there are obvious, where there are market failures, I think clearly there's an argument for us being involved, and that you've seen that with the work that went on with well before my time with the British Patient Capital and the review, and then implementing that. I think a budget as well. I talked about an extra £200 million to do exactly what you're suggesting in the life sciences space, which is one of our I'd say globally most competitive industries, and something that the importance of which has only been enhanced by what we're all going through. And that was to do what you said. It was to provide that equity capital at a fund level rather than a firm level, which to me feels slightly more appropriate. Yeah. But in that space where we thought there was an issue that we could help nudge things along, and we've done that more broadly elsewhere as well. So we've got a record of doing that. Obviously, the future fund that is launching tomorrow will be interesting, because we'll see what the take up is. We'll see what it's like. That is a slightly different way of doing providing quasi equity capital. We will create a portfolio there, and it will be interesting from a policy making perspective to see how that performs as a guide to what might be worthwhile doing in the future as well.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Okay, Lord Tuggin, did you want to come in on this question?
The government had very ambitious infrastructure plans. I wondered whether, in the light of what has happened, further thought has been given as to how one might promote a greater degree of private finance from abroad in our big infrastructure projects. I mean, certainly private finance at home too, but I wondered to what extent thought was being given to encouraging private finance from abroad in infrastructure projects.
That's an excellent question. And we obviously have an infrastructure financing review that's been conducted, and we are due to respond to the National Infrastructure Strategy, or the National Infrastructure Commission, to us. And those questions will be considered as part of that when we respond. So I can't get into it now, but I think you're right. We have enormous needs. The government is going to do an enormous amount, as we talked about at budget, but there will always be a need to attract capital. It's something that historically we as a country have done very well, and we want to make sure that we continue to be a place where people have the confidence to invest to help fund some of the things that we would like to see. And I think it's also important, as we know, and all the research tells us, that foreign direct investment also brings with it productivity enhancing know-how and R&D as well, which has spillover benefits for the rest of the economy. So yes, it's something we're looking at, and we will talk about it in more detail when we publish the National Infrastructure Strategy later this year.
Okay, Baroness Bowles.
Chancellor, what further thought has HMT given to local authority finances if the extra money that's already been given won't, well, it probably almost certainly won't cover the full cost and losses due to the pandemic to local government finances? Are you prepared to see some local authorities declare themselves insolvent? And if they do, what's the contingency plan?
So as a former local government minister, I care very deeply about local government, and they've done a heroic job being on the front line of helping to respond to the crisis that we're all going through. I think what I'd say is my colleague, the local government Secretary of State, is in constant dialogue with the sector about what's going on, which is why we've provided considerable direct cash support, 2 tranches of about £1.6 billion over the past couple of months. But we've also brought forward payments of about 850 million in adult social care grant payments, and allowed councils to defer business rates of over £2.5 billion to help with any cash flow issues. So there has been quite considerable support already, but of course, my colleague is in close touch with the sector.
That doesn't quite tell me what the contingency plan is, but I mean, you're telling me it's not your problem, maybe.
I mean, well, it's also a problem. I mean, there's a well worked framework for that, which you will be familiar with, and is operated by MHCLG.
Right. I mean, but looking further forward, I mean, there's still a lot of expenses that local authorities are going to come up against. I mean, the business rate review has been delayed, but town centres still need major restructuring, and there'll be changes needed following the effect of the virus on retail and hospitality sectors. So are you going to provide financial and administrative tools to help local authorities to succeed with those projects?
Well, we have already put in place the Towns Fund, which does exactly what you've described and provides support through local authorities for high streets, and the High Streets Fund works together with that to get money into communities for projects to revitalise their high streets and ensure strong local economies. So that support is there and is in various tranches of being deployed. But I think there, in terms of the business rate side of it, in one sense, because we've provided a lot of support to local authorities by covering or cancelling the business rates for many of these companies this year. When we do that in the retail, hospitality, leisure sector, we provide the equivalent amount to local authorities, so they're not out of pocket, and those are obviously the most exposed sectors.
Lord Fox, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, please. Thank you. Chancellor, I mean, you've pushed the role to the MLCG, but you're the people who hold the purse strings. They don't have any money to spend in local authorities if you don't let them have it. So So there must be a sense of you either planning to give them the money to do this or not. And secondly, you mentioned schemes that were in existence already, but this is a scale that is far higher than pre-existing schemes. There's many shopping concerns are going to the wall. Town centres are going to be transformed with empty shops unless councils are able to work with their communities and change these things. But what sort of money is Treasury going to make available to go out?
I think actually the Towns Fund and High Streets Fund are of quite considerable quantum in order to do exactly that. We've already provided, as I said, over £3 billion for direct support for the services that they're providing. But I probably would slightly respond by saying I don't think the answer to everything is money. Shops going out of business or high streets changing. Sometimes money can't solve that problem. It might be a change in shopping patterns and how people consume. And if we're living with a virus and people can't shop in the same way, that money can't solve that problem. And actually, maybe the answer is to look at what we're already doing, by the way, which is about changing planning and change of use planning regulations on high streets to make sure that we can rejig our high streets to be places where communities come together, but they will do slightly different things. And actually the answer could well be, as has been mentioned in various reviews of high streets, is flexibility around some planning, actually, for example. So it might be you want to have more offices or more resi on top of fewer shops on a high street to create a vibrant community and do it that way. So I think there's a range of different things one can do. Money isn't always the only solution or indeed the first solution we should turn to.
Okay, Lord Tuggin.
Chancellor, I'm sure that your officials have briefed you on the report that this committee produced in 2019 on social care. So first of all, I want to ask you whether the government has it in mind to expedite social care reforms in the light of the recommendations that this committee made. And in particular, I'm wondering to what extent you're considering a social insurance tax to contribute to the cost of social care.
So I think our plans remain as the Social Care Secretary has outlined. We committed in the election to three things. One is to commence cross-party talks to try and find a sustainable solution to social care. So that process started, but obviously right now everyone is focused rightly on dealing with coronavirus. But that is the plan. We also committed to maintaining extra investment of £1 billion a year in social care, which we stand by. And thirdly, with regard to whatever long-term reform emerges from that process, we thought it was important to ensure people did not have to sell their house immediately to fund the care in the short term. So those were some of the principles we set out, and as I said, the Social Care Secretary started that process. Obviously, we said we wanted to see that process to conclusion. That remains, but like many other things at the moment, we are rightly focused on dealing with the pandemic and the impacts of that.
I mean, of course, I quite understand that everybody's got a lot on their plate, not least Secretary of State for Health, and that focusing on the immediate crisis must be the principal priority. But I think that it can be said that the pandemic has highlighted issues to which we were drawing attention last year, and that the one key lesson that has surely come out of the pandemic is the need to raise both the status and the financing of the social care sector. It has been a poor relation by comparison with the NHS. Save Our NHS is very good, absolutely, but Save Our Social Care needs perhaps to be get its priority raised a bit as well.
I think you're right in saying social care. The people who are working in social care are, again, they're doing a heroic job in difficult circumstances on the front line of this. I would say, as the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is talking about every day, and today was in Parliament talking about exactly this. They've been uppermost in his mind and this government's mind, and we're doing everything we can to give them the security and they need to do their job. It's probably not for me to repeat all of that, but I think we remain committed to saying what we said in our manifesto and in the campaign. We want to find a long-term solution to the system. I don't think that's straightforward, and we would like to try and do that on a cross-party basis to ensure that whatever solution we get at has the best chance of being sustainable for the long term and has common buy-in from everybody as much as is possible. And as soon as is practical and we can, and no doubt the Social Care Secretary will be getting on with that. But I would say that there's plenty of work that has happened on that already as well. So it's not as if when that process starts, it starts with a blank sheet of paper. Your report, I noted there's a report from the House of Commons select committees that came together. There's things that we looked at previously that were commissioned by various governments. So there's lots of different, for Andrew Dill not being the obvious one. So there's lots of different ideas floating around. So I said, when we start, it won't be from a blank sheet of paper.
Thank you.
Just on that point, the Secretary of State should have responded to our report within 8 weeks of its publication. He asked for more time. We've been told privately that the problem, and this is not a problem with our report, there have been endless reports and endless promises of green papers. And we've been told the problem really is with the Treasury, who do not want to face up to the fact that the shortage of funding, which has accumulated, has taken place with increased demand. And this is why we're finding social care workers paid so badly, and people who are paying privately in nursing homes being charged an extra 40% to subsidise local authority workers. I mean, is it true that the Treasury have balked at the cost, and this is what has held up the government coming to a conclusion on this matter?
I think the Treasury and the government are one and the same, right? It's one
government.
I think the reason is that social care reform hasn't happened under successive governments for a long time, because it's very difficult. It is a difficult problem where there isn't clear consensus on how to solve it, and crucially, any reform would be expensive, and that's the point that's acknowledged, and obviously has to be paid for. So there has to be consensus both on the reform and how it's paid for, and those things need to come together. I think the Social Care Secretary has made that point as well. I would stand by that. So in that sense, it's not about anyone balking at anything, right? We just need to find a reform that people can coalesce around, that we think is sensible and sustainable, and also, crucially, that we can afford it. And we need to know how we're going to pay for it, and that has to be part of the same conversation.
Okay, well, perhaps we could send you a copy of our report and certainly the evidence, where there was enormous consensus and very little division on what the way forward might be. Baroness Kingsmill.
Yes, well, Chancellor, I mean, following on from that, I mean, brutally, the social care market is in dire straits. I mean, the events that are happening in North Tyneside at the moment suggest that it is right on the edge. The care providers have given the local authority a 5-day ultimatum. And I'm sure that there are, from what I read and from what I'm told, that there are similar situations boiling beneath the surface elsewhere. I mean, the real truth of the matter is the social care sector has been seriously underfunded and continues to be seriously underfunded. And we are relying heavily on the education, if you like, of both the providers, but in particular, the workers. I wondered if you would comment on that, on the dire straits and on the sense that the market may be failing totally. And also if you would give consideration to those health workers who are terribly underpaid, who have nevertheless, both those that are in domestically and those that are working in care homes, they're on the front line, and should they not get hazard pay? That would be something that you could very easily do. It's in the power of the Treasury to do that. It would not be a huge amount of money compared to the sums of money that are being paid elsewhere. and it would be something which would justify the clapping that we have every Thursday evening.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in my previous role, I saw significant increases in funding for social care over the last couple of years, considerable increases in funding in social care, which were warmly welcomed at the time by various stakeholders, and including the Local Government Association over the past 2 local government finance settlements, both of which have been record settlements over the last decade, with funds increasing in real terms for core spending power, north of 3%, and I think maybe even 4% for the last one, but of that order of magnitude, which is pretty considerable pace of increase and far beyond the rate of tax rises or economic growth. So I don't think anyone can say that there hasn't been lots of extra resource going into social care, and actually you've seen the results of that, with delayed transfers of care considerably reduced from the peak as a result of some of that investment, much better working between the NHS and social care at a local level, through the integrated partnerships that we've set out to do that. So actually you're seeing the results of that on the ground. You've seen extra funding go in. Of course, people are working right now in very difficult conditions under enormous pressure, and they are to be commended for that, and which is why we have deployed considerable extra resource to the front line to do exactly that.
Is that your answer? I mean, are you not concerned that the market may actually be failing?
Well, I think local authorities in their individual areas actually have a statutory responsibility. I can't remember the exact phrasing. Again, you're asking me about the something that is not my specific brief, but my recollection is that local authorities actually have a statutory undertaking to make sure that they can provide the care that's required in their communities. Obviously, for them individually, they'll make those decisions about how best to do that.
Do you feel that the work of the care workers justifies a hazard pay at the moment as an interim payment before pay can be properly considered?
Well, I think I think we have set up a life assurance scheme specifically for frontline health and social care staff, which is something that the sector wanted and we were keen to put in place, and that recognises the risks that those staff are bearing during the course of the incredibly important and life-saving work that they're doing. So that has been put in place, and there's probably not much more beyond that I can speak to.
Well, perhaps you could take it away with you and give it some further consideration, because I think there are a lot of very deserving frontline staff who are suffering shortages and having to rely on things like universal credit. And it seems a great shame that the amount of money which is going elsewhere, that we can't find it in our hearts and in our pockets to dig out some, say, £1,000 each for hazard pay in the short term.
Okay, Lord Skidelsky.
Maybe on
Lord Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, we can't hear your question. Can you start again?
Just before we move off social care.
Yeah, go on, Chancellor.
If I may, you said there was overwhelming consensus. I'd be really interested to know, in terms of how the reforms would be funded, what was the overwhelming consensus on how that should be achieved?
Well, I think what we can do is we'll send you a copy of our report, which sets out some of the funding problems, and which also deals with DILNOT and other issues, and which was overwhelmingly supported in the debate, in the debates that we've had in the House of Lords.
Because from the summary I saw, I think suggested an incremental cost of about £15 billion annually, and I was just wondering what the consensus was amongst members of the committee as to how that ought to be funded, because it was quite a significant sum.
It is a significant sum, but it's relative to the money which has gone into the health service, which is a point which is made in the report, and the costs which fall upon the health service because of bed blocking and so on. It needs to be looked at in a rather broader context. I think that was the essence of the report, but rather than get drawn.
I'd be interested, because that, as we discussed, generally is the issue, right? It's well, how do you fund the incremental resources? And I'd say if there's consensus on that, it would be helpful. I'd be interested in knowing what the consensus was. I presume at that level, it presumably would be just general taxation. So that would be 2 to 3 points on basic rate of income tax.
Well, the problem, Chancellor, is that the demand has gone up at the same time as the resources available have gone down. And the result of that has been that the care workers are being treated very badly, and the homes are only, the nursing homes, now care homes are only able to continue because those who are paying for their own care are being charged up to, I think from memory, 40% more in fees in order to subsidize those people who do not have resources. So it is a fundamental duty, is it not, to provide a net and a ladder to catch those people in who are in need. It's the basis of the welfare system. And as far as social care is concerned, the report concluded it was a national scandal and that people were falling through the net. But I don't want to take the committee's time too much on this. We'll send you the report, and we'd be very interested in your response to it. Lord Skidelsky, can we hear you now?
Can you hear me now? Yes. Chancellor, as we're talking about money, have you considered making permanent the increases to universal credit, which have been made for the duration of the crisis? Because a priori, there's no obvious reason for thinking that the needs of claimants are going to be less when the lockdown is lifted and normal conditions return.
Lord Schleswig, yes, you're right. Those were increases that were made on a temporary basis for the crisis. And unfortunately, I have to give the same answer that I've given to others. I just can't be drawn on future budget or indeed welfare policy.
And well, on another matter on which you might not be able to be drawn, we've had quite a lot of evidence of distress and difficulty caused by the waiting period for universal credit. Have you, or might you consider converting the allowances into a gift?
I think I haven't got the exact stat in front of me, but I'm sure we can send it to you. There's ability for everybody to receive an advance payment very quickly, and a very large number and percentage of people have successfully been able to do that. And the Work and Pension Secretary worked very hard at making sure that process was as rapid as possible.
But quite a lot of gaps there. The evidence has been very strong that a sizable proportion of claimants just get into financial difficulties because of the waiting period, yeah. And the allowances don't seem to be able to. That's again difficult. It gives them a difficult set of claims.
As I said, I don't have the figures in front of me for the processing time for the advance payments, but it is certainly the case that everyone is eligible for a very fast advance payment on that. I'd be happy to get the figures exactly and send them.
Thank you.
Okay, Lord Stern.
I'm just conscious, Lord, for sight of time, because I think we're running on an hour and a half, and I assume we're wrapping up, if that's all right.
Well, it's the first I've heard of it. We were going to be an hour and a half, but I appreciate that you're under a lot of pressure. Lord Stern we're getting towards the end of our questions, but he has an important question to ask. Lord Stern.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chancellor, for your strong and effective action. And I'd appreciate it if you could convey our recognition to the people at the Treasury and the Civil Service for the tremendous job they're doing under enormous pressure. It is enormously appreciated. My question is about the strategy for recovery. I think we've recognised the importance of growth and investment in the recovery story. That's the period after the current rescue phase that we're in now. So we're talking about the end of this year and into next. And it's the nature of the investment and how you foster it that I think it is at the centre of the policy agenda. So we should be looking, I think, if we want an employment-oriented, inclusive recovery, at investments that are rapid in implementation, labour-intensive, and with strong Keynesian Hicks multipliers. And that's the kind of thing we should be looking for. And here are some examples: retrofitting of buildings, EV charging stations, pedestrian and cycling in cities, broadband, trees, land use, and so on physical capital. There's a whole range of things that satisfy those three criteria: rapid, labour intensive, and with strong multipliers. And if that's recognised as a strategy, then surely we can see the kinds of policies that would drive that through, and the sense of strategic direction would give confidence for investment. Would you agree on the centrality of those kinds of issues to a strong and sustainable recovery, please? Chancellor, you're muted.
Thank you, Lord Stern. The team will deeply appreciate your comments about their efforts, which I will make sure they are aware of. So thank you for that. And look, broadly, I think sorry, it cut out in the middle, which I was trying to fiddle with it. But I think you were talking about stimulating a recovery in a labour-intensive way with strong multipliers, which I think is all very sensible. I'm obviously spending a good amount of time thinking about what the right labour market policies are. Obviously, we can already see some of the unemployment numbers today and the various scenarios we started this meeting with talking about. So you're absolutely right. It will be a priority of mine to make sure that we can get as many of these people back into work as quickly as possible, and looking at opportunities for creating new employment in areas which also have a economic benefit to us should obviously be a priority. The few that you mentioned, I completely agree with, and we are already doing, and arguably should try and do more, but there's a capacity constraint element of some of them, which is cycling, and where you would have seen the announcements recently on that from the Transport Secretary, and I think you said broadband, where we have a very ambitious plan to roll out broadband. And again, the capital is there. We provided to do the work, the £5 billion to fill in the last 20%. I think and we know, and you're absolutely right, there's a slight bottleneck potentially with as there is with lots of infrastructure around supply chain in terms of labour. So trying to match those two things together seems eminently sensible. There's a different constraint on broadband as well. It's just about how much of your roads do you want dug up at one time. But you're right, in terms of trying to match the labour market or the unemployment to some of these areas, that is absolutely what we're thinking about at the moment.
Okay, I'd like to just, if I may, Lord Stern, just have a final question from Lord Burns.
I just wanted to say something on the funding, Lord Forsyth, very quickly, and Terry, I'm sure, would follow up. I think now is the moment to introduce the National Investment Bank. We have Chancellor touched on that in the earlier conversation, but this is absolutely the moment, and we should recognise also on funding that if you increase demand through investment in a deeply depressed economy, which it will be over these next months and perhaps a year or so, you get a lot of tax revenue back through the multiplier, and that is a very important feature of funding, which does not apply in a fully employed economy, but does apply in this economy. Thank you.
Okay, Lord Burns.
Thank you. Can I also say I agree with Lord Stern's remarks about the impressive performance of the Treasury during this crisis time. I'm sure you appreciate that many of our questions today have centred on suggestions of spending yet more money, in a position which no doubt you're very familiar with by now. And your job, of course, is to bring together all of these demands at a time when revenues are going to be lower than we had previously hoped. Does it mean that we are facing a longish period when debt is going to be high and only falling gradually, much it's done after previous periods of wartime?
Well, thank you, Lord Burns, for your comments as well. I'll make sure that Tom hears them and passes them on to everybody. And look, you'll know this better than everyone, right? We're grappling with exactly what you described. I think where public finances are after this is unclear at this moment. Clearly, debt will be higher. I mean, that is obvious given the scale of borrowing that we have. And at that point, we talked right at the beginning about the medium-term problem, which is what actually is the long-term damage, the scarring, and what does that mean for our structural deficit going forward. And then there's a separate question about aggregate debt levels, about what are prudent and sensible to maintain. And I haven't made firm decisions on that yet. Obviously, there's a live macroeconomic debate that you will be well aware of with the work of Olivier Blanchard and others. And given where rates are, that has a direct impact on what a sustainable debt level might be. And one has to also have a view on the sustainability of that low rate environment. So obviously those things are in my head. It's probably too early to know what the answer is just now, because we don't exactly know where we'll be depending on the severity and duration of the current economic crisis. But as I said, I think you have rightly highlighted the things that are on my mind.
Okay, well, on that note, Chancellor, I think, as you've heard, the whole committee have been hugely impressed by what you've been able to achieve and what the Treasury has been able to achieve in the face of unprecedented challenges. It must have felt a bit of a hospital pass when you went into the Treasury, but I think all of us think you've not only performed well before us this afternoon and given us much reassurance, you've answered our questions, even the ones which perhaps you shouldn't have answered or been asked. And we're very grateful to you for coming to the committee and sharing with us your thoughts. And we wish you well in the weeks and months ahead, which are so crucial to the future of our country. Thank you very much.
That's very kind, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for all your questions. Look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Right. Okay, if the committee could just stay online once we're off.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.